In day 2 of the Airthings Masters, Magnus Carlsen had the white pieces against 16-year-old chess prodigy Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa, and Magnus was pushing hard for the win because you get 3 points for a win and 1 point for a draw. So we had a really fighting game on our hands. Let's see what happened here, and if you love a daily chess video, hit that subscribe button, never miss an upload. So Magnus kicks off with pawn to d4 here. We had knight f6, pawn c4, pawn e6 now, so Pragg invites the Nimzo Indian, but Magnus doesn't go knight c3, he goes knight f3 inviting the Queen's Indian, but Pragg didn't go pawn b6, instead he went d5, going back into a Queen's Gambit declined. Now we had knight c3, pawn to c5 now from Pragg, and this starts a semi-Tarrasch defence. So there are different ways for white to play here. Magnus goes pawn to e3, keeping some symmetry with the pawn structure. We had knight c6. Now pawn takes on d5, the e-pawn recaptured, and the bishop develops to b5, preparing to castle the king. Pragg now took on d4. We had pawn recaptures. The bishop came to d6 developing, castles from white. Pragg did the same. And pawn h3 now from Magnus. So the bishop g4 pin is annoying. When this knight's come here, the bishop is out here. So Magnus prevents that, and Pragg does similar with pawn h6. The rook now came to the e-file. We had bishop f5 developing. Knight to e5 now from Magnus. So he can't yet develop his bishop to f4. He couldn't put the bishop on e3. Well, he could, but then it blocks the rook. So it's very logical to just hop the knight in, prepare bishop f4, and you're very happy for black to exchange here. That just helps you. Then you've got loads of pressure on d5. Not good for black. So instead Pragg goes rook c8. He brings his rook to the open file. Bishop f4 now came. Rook e8. The other one hits the open file. Rook c1. Magnus does similar. And now queen b6. The queen activates. So the opening phase of the game is done. Magnus now needs to find how to proceed. So there's some pressure coming down the b-file here. This pawn behind the bishop. This knight could be coming to e4 soon. Then this c3 knight is distracted. The bishop could drop. So Magnus goes for this positional plan of taking on c6. The pawn recaptures and he plays knight a4. And the idea is that he's coming into this c5 square. Although what we'll see is that after queen to a6, he now plays this really interesting rook lift with rook to e3, and he's actually preparing to win this pawn on c6 rather than just blockade it with the knight on c5. But this is a double-edged way to play, because by bringing those pieces to the queen side, he does leave some threats around his own king, as we'll see. So Pragg now plays the knight into e4, covering this c3 square, and that's why Magnus goes pawn to f3, kicking that knight away so that he can carry on with this plan of picking up the pawn here. But he is now weakening this king along this diagonal, along this rank, and that's always a risky strategy. So we now had queen b7 from Pragg, an excellent move. It steps out of any double attacks here after the rook takes on these two pieces, and it also sets a trap. So if you now take this with the rook, then you can capture back here, and white's not working with the tactics. So if you take with the knight, you can pick up this bishop. If you take with the rook, then again the bishop can take here. The rook is now loose. If it moves away, we pick up again here. Not working for white. So instead of taking that pawn, Magnus plays bishop h2. Now that bishop is defended, he's threatening to take the pawn. But Pragg ignores this. He plays knight to e6. Now he can't defend it anyway, but again now there's a problem with taking that pawn. But here Magnus does take the plunge. He picks it up with the knight. And here Pragg had an excellent move to pretty much win the game on the spot. And if you want to pause it and look for the combination, please do so. So here black could have played takes on h2. The king has to recapture and then knight f4. And the point is you're bringing the rook down to e2 here, threatening to take here, and there's just nothing that white can do to prevent this slow motion threat. Say you block the file with knight e5, well pawn f6 is kicking that one out of the way. first we exchange on c3, I should say. Now you kick pawn to f6. And once the knight moves away, you're bringing in the rook. The queen is soon coming to d7, hitting this knight, attacking this h3 pawn along with the knight. There's just way too many tactical problems in the position. The game is gone. But instead of playing like this, Pragg first brought the knight into f4. But this is slightly different because now after knight e5, blocking the e-file, you can't go f6 or you're simply dropping this knight here. So that's why instead we had bishop takes on e5, the pawn recaptured, and now the knight went into d3. Now it might look like you're just losing two minor pieces for the rook, which is never good, but if you actually take here, then black can capture here first. That's the problem, and here you've won a piece. So after the knight came to d3 here, Magnus chops the rooks on the c-file. They all came off, the queen recaptured, and now he'd love to bring this knight back into the game via c3, but the problem here is it runs into queen c5 check. If you come to f1, you're getting mated. If you go to h1, you're losing the queen, and there's even checkmating patterns in the air, so you just can't play like this. So in this position here, instead of bringing the queen back in, we had bishop to g3, giving the king some room, covering the f2 square. But this gives Pragg time to go pawn to d4. So even though he's a pawn down here, he now covers this square, and this knight has a really hard time getting back into the game. So pawn b3 gives it some possibility here. It also protects that knight and prepares to activate the queen. Queen c6 now came from Pragg, queen d2. Both players took a timeout to improve their kings. The bishop dropped back to g6, and here Magnus has to make a decision. So he could drop the knight back into b2, but the reason he didn't do this is it gets very, very drawish after a line like this. The bishop can drop back, the pawn advances to c2, and here we have this classic opposite coloured bishop's endgame, where although white is a pawn up, it's next to impossible to win when you've got that opposite blockader. So that's why Magnus didn't play like this. He was playing more ambitiously. Instead he went queen a5, looking to pick up a second pawn. But this allows Pragg to play queen c1, invading Magnus's position, looking menacing around his king. Magnus picked up the pawn, the queen centralised here. It's now looking at this pawn as well, and best here would have been queen a5. Now if knight f4, at least the queen can get back and defend the kingside position. But as it was in the game, in this position here we had knight c3 from Magnus. A really tricky little move, because if you capture that knight, you lose your queen here. Now that's not actually the end of the line, because the pawn can come to c2, but you then have bishop f4. If the pawn queens, then you capture like this, and although it's opposite coloured bishops, now you're 2 pawns ahead, they're connected passes, that's a winning position. So that's why we didn't have the pawn capturing on c3 here. Instead we had knight to f4, and you can't actually take this knight, or after takes with check, pawn to g3, queen d2 picks up the knight here. And even if you don't go pawn g3, if you move the king, you're just losing this piece at the end of all the lines. So you can't take that knight. Instead Magnus tried this move knight to d1, the queen moved away to d2, and the knight came into f2. But these pieces are just horribly on top of each other now. We can see this one can't actually move, or else you take on g2 with check. So we had knight to e2 here, and there's a slow motion threat to go queen e1, queen g1, checkmate. So the pawn h4 move gave the king some room, and now we had queen to e1 anyway, and here there's a threat to check. After the king moves up, then go bishop f5. So the queen came to d7, covering this diagonal, and now there's many ways to win, but Pragg chose this one. He took on g3, and the king can't recapture here, or we take on e5 with check. If the king comes here, we pick up the queen like this, and if you go pawn to f4, well, now we check from e3. After the king moves away, we pick up the knight, and so on. Black's just a whole piece up with a passed pawn here. So we didn't have any of this stuff. After we had this knight g3 move, Magnus tried taking here, but now simply knight to f1 check came, king h3, and the knight came back to e3. You're now attacking this one because this has blocked the queen's defense. And if you try and move it away, say to g4, well, we check here, king g3, and we pick up the queen with this fork. So we didn't have this played on the board. Magnus tried queen b2, but after bishop c2 here from Prague, here Magnus threw in the towel because you're picking up this knight on f2. If you try and move it away, say to g4, once again we're mating. The king comes to g3, the queen takes on g2, king f4, and knight d5 is a beautiful finish, which we never actually saw. To see another amazing Prague versus Carlsen game, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.